Who is my biggest Falcons draft miss in recent memory? And are there useful lessons about the draft and team building that we can learn from those mistakes?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And, of course, I've been covering the Falcons for 18 years and basically a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day as your first listen, as these everydayers, as we call them. Right. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's an episode for those of you that have been longtime everydayers of this pod, especially when it comes to draft assessments, where we'll talk quite a bit about some of my recent draft evaluations over not only recent years, but previous years. This episode will kind of be a de facto Q&A where we got a couple of Locked On Falcons Insider questions. And if you want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider and get priority on future Q&As, you can do so by joining that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You not only get access to, you get one-on-one access with me, you get priority on questions, and you also get access to film breakdowns of the Falcons' recent draft prospects, as well as extended all 22 reviews when we get closer to the season. The most recent breakdown on Jace McCullough. This week, you'll be able to get one on Casey Washington. Next week, Zion Logue, et cetera, et cetera. So let's get into that first question from Eddie R. He says, "Hey, Aaron, I'm curious if a Falcons player has ever far exceeded the ceiling on your player comp after they were drafted. I started listening and subsequently watching during the 2020 season. I say that because I think AJ Terrell might be a good candidate for this, but his player comp would have happened prior to me finding your show." So thank you, Eddie, for becoming an everydayer. But yeah, my ceiling comparison for AJ Terrell was Darius Slay. So I don't think AJ's really exceeded his ceiling, right? My eye level for AJ was AJ Bouye. I think he's reached that part. I think the main difference between him and Darius Slay, and I talked about this in the episode where I broke down AJ Terrell, was just the AJ's lack of on-ball production is going to probably prevent him from reaching a level that Darius Slay reached in his NFL career, just because Darius Slay tends to get more pass breakups and more interceptions and whatnot. And it reminds me, recently I did an episode talking about AJ and his potential upcoming payday. And there were a couple of comments about, we can't pay AJ because he doesn't get any picks. And again, that to me is something that I don't necessarily hold against AJ, because when I evaluated the player, I was like, he's probably not going to be a guy that's getting, 4 or 5 picks every single year. And there may be years like we've seen the last 2 years where he gets no interceptions. And I don't think it's fair to hold it against a player for him being basically what you thought he was supposed to be. But to answer your question, since 2018, where I started giving floor, ceiling, and eye level comparisons for the vast majority of Falcons picks since that 2018 draft, the two players that I would say that have most exceeded my expectations in terms of their ceiling came from that first draft class, that 2018 draft class. Those were Russell Gage and Foye Oluokun. And I think that kind of illustrates that there was a little bit of a learning curve as I started doing that then, and I've gotten better at it. So I feel like that hasn't really been the case the last couple of years. But I mentioned this before. I consider Oluokun to be my biggest miss in this 6-year cycle. My ceiling comp for him was Kamal Ishmael. So clearly I thought he was going to be a quality backup, but not anything more than like maybe a low level starter, and he's blown those expectations away. Russell Gage, I didn't have a ceiling comp for him because back in 2018, I was kind of only doing like 1, maybe 2 comps for these guys before 2019. And then 2020 was the first draft where I was pretty much giving a floor, ceiling, and eye level for pretty much every player. But my eye level comp for Russell Gage was Eric Weems and Akeem King, and he's far exceeded, whatever I would have thought the ceiling would have been. because I was thinking at the time, like, Russell Gage is going to be a career special teams player. And I think that's the role the Falcons envisioned for him. But he obviously became much better as a wide receiver in the NFL. And it's interesting that I used both of those players as their comp, just because at the time when we drafted Russell Gage, we weren't necessarily 100% convinced whether or not he was going to be a wide receiver or cornerback in the NFL. He played both at LSU. I thought in Weems, the reason I comped him to Weems was just because, like, yeah, Weems is not a difference maker in offense. He's going to be a career special teams. That's why he's going to stick in the league. Akeem King, I compared him just because, Russell Gage had the size and the length that, that sort of Seahawk style corner. Akeem King was a safety that had these plus tools and athletic traits, and the Falcons tried to convert him to a corner. Didn't really stick. I was skeptical of whether or not Russell Gage would do that at the NFL level. And so that's part of the reason why I had that sort of comp specifically on Akeem King. But those two would be the prior biggest misses. I think prior to 2018, going all the way back to 2001, when I first started pretending that I knew what I was talking about with evaluating players back then, I was watching one bowl game and then being like, I know what Michael Vick and Drew Brees are going to be in the NFL. Although I would probably been pretty decent on those projections. But anyway, my two biggest Falcons misses, probably from 2001 to 2018, in terms of guys that far exceeded my expectations in terms of what I thought their ceiling was. And again, I wasn't doing specific ceiling comps at the time, but it would probably be Grady Jarrett and Desmond Trufant. I thought Grady would be a good pro, a solid NFL starter. But if you had told me at his peak, he would have been the fourth best D tackle in the NFL, I would have called you like, oh, you're just a homer saying stuff, right? Which I still say something that you're a homer saying stuff because it sounds good, not because it's true, which most of the time is true, but occasionally in the case of Grady Jarrett is the case. And Desmond Trufant is similar. I thought he would be a quality number 2 corner, but if you had told me he would be a number 1 corner that would be able to lock down basically all but like the 3 best wide receivers in the NFL during his career, I wouldn't have probably believed you. So I think in general, that kind of shows you, like, my hit rate is pretty good, or I should say my non-miss rate is pretty good, right? It's like, because my hit rate it's debatable what exactly is a hit. If I'm giving these spectrum of outcomes where you got the floor, the ceiling, and the eye level, and the player somewhere in the middle, it's like, is that a hit? It's in the ballpark, right? You made contact on the bat, but whether you got on base or whatever, I guess is debatable. But I think the beauty of that threefold approach of having the floor, ceiling, and eye level is you get this sort of spectrum of outcomes for each draft pick. And I know a lot of people look at that as sort of like hedging your bets, but I think there's worthwhile lessons from that threefold draft approach, which we'll talk about in a minute. But like, very few players wind up exceeding my expectations because we have this wide spectrum of outcomes. And I'm going to wind up linking to a Google Doc in the description below, so you can sort of see all of my floor, ceiling, and eye level comps since 2018 for the Falcons draft picks. But I look at it, I think I've only had 5 misses of those 42 players that I've done that, not counting this year's draft, which is about a 12% miss rate. Doesn't mean my hit rate is 88%, but 5 players I think either far exceeded my ceilings, which include Russell Gage and Foye Oluokun, and 3 players that I don't think quite reached the floor that I thought they would be entering the NFL. And we'll talk more about some of the worthwhile lessons that we can learn from some of these misses. And one of those lessons is that maybe day 2 draft picks are probably more valuable than we probably think they are. And we'll explore that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So guys, it is summertime. It's hot outside, but that doesn't mean that you can't make your bets over at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Of course, you got the NBA Finals, you got NHL Finals, although, those might be over soon. But of course, baseball is going to be going strong. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on, who's going to be the finals MVP, who's going to hoist that Stanley Cup, who's going to hit one out of the park. And of course, not only do you have great bets to make during the summer on baseball, basketball, and hockey, while those sports last, you have the upcoming NFL season. You can bet on the Falcons, how many wins they're going to have. Is Kirk Cousins going to be the MVP? Is Raheem Morris going to win Coach of the Year? Who's going to be Offensive Rookie of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year? You got player specials like how many yards and touchdowns Kirk Cousins is going to throw this year, all available over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. FanDuel, just visit FanDuel.com/locked on, and you can win big this summer. Visit FanDuel America's #1 sportsbook. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to tell you guys about Locked On Sports Today, the free 24/7 streaming sports channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So when we talk about the lessons learned, right, and when we look back at the draft, the general rule of thumb is, you got to wait 3 years. I personally tend to think 5 years is a better, more accurate perspective because by then guys will get to their second contract. And while I don't think guys earning a second contract is the end all be all, or I should say be all end all, that's the correct way of saying it. But I do think it's a valuable, useful way of judging players and whether or not, a guy can stick beyond his rookie season in the NFL and get a second contract, whether that's with the team that drafted him or, another free agent team and sort of how big is that contract. That's also useful in sort of judging whether or not a player is good. Like if guys signing, for $10 million a year versus a 1 year sort of veteran minimum contract, that kind of tells you what the general perception of the player. Doesn't mean that perception is always accurate, but you know what I mean. So, I say all that just because it's going to be hard to be too judgmental about the 2022 and 2023 draft classes when we look back at these things because they haven't been in the league yet for 3 years. And so I feel like so far my evaluations on those players seems pretty solid, at least again, based off of the limited data we have. But, a year from now or two, they may look very differently. But, let's talk a little bit more about the floor, ceiling, and eye level, because if you're, an everydayer, you're used to those statements, but I'm sure some of you guys don't really know exactly what I mean by that because maybe this is the first episode you're talking about it, or you only started watching the show in the last couple of weeks and we haven't done a draft evaluation since the end of May yet, so you don't really know what I'm talking about. So when I say floor, ceiling, and eye level, I do that for every draft pick the Falcons have had since 2018, as I mentioned earlier. And the floor to me is what a player is upon entering the NFL. It's not sort of what he could be by the end of his rookie season or with a little bit of development. It is week one of his rookie season. What do I expect this player to be able to contribute at? And I use NFL player comparisons to sort of illustrate that point. The ceiling to me is the max potential of a player in terms of if he gets fully developed, perfect situation, what can he wind up being in the NFL? And as I mentioned before, and as we'll talk about in a bit, very few players reach their ceilings based off of how I've done it the recent years. And then the eye level is to me the halfway point between the player and the floor and the ceiling, right? If you're standing in a room, you get it, the floor, the ceiling, and your eye level is roughly, short kings out there. Maybe that's not but you get what I'm saying. So, that to me is the most realistic outcome for the player because it's going to indicate that he'll get some development, but probably not the max development, right? And you, of course, can be the judge, again, looking at that Google Doc in the description below. But to me, there's only been 6 players over the 42 that I've assessed from 2018 through 2023 that, to me, have hit their ceilings, right? Now, you may feel like it's a different number, right? Again, Foye Oluokun, Russell Gage are 2 of them. Chris Lindstrom at Joe Bitonio was my ceiling comp for him. Again, if you pushed me, I probably would say Lindstrom is a little bit below Bitonio, but, I'm not going to – I think it's splitting hairs at this point. John Kaminsky's ceiling comp was Adam Gotsis. I feel like he's hit that. Michael Walker's ceiling comp was Kamale Correa. I feel like he's hit that. Jalen Hawkins was Matthias Farley. I feel like he's hit that. So – in total, so far, that's about 15% of the players that the Falcons have drafted over the last, 6 years have hit or exceeded their ceilings. And then I think there's another 10 that have probably hit their eye level. So that gives you, in conjunction with the guys that have hit their ceiling, about 40%, a little shy of 40% of the Falcons draft picks over the last 6 years have reached their eye levels or above. And so that's basically telling you that roughly about 60% of the players don't far exceed their floors. Like some of those guys are probably halfway between their floor and their eye level, maybe waist level, navel gazing sort of level, I guess you could say. But it kind of reiterates the point you've heard me make over the years, which is that I don't think player development in the NFL is as high a number or a significant percentage as probably most fans assume. That most fans assume when you draft a player, he's going to be dramatically better in 2 or 3 years than he is coming out of college. And what this information is telling me, at least based off of my assessment of the Falcons draft picks, is that for 60% of those players, that's not really true. And I think some people would argue that that's a contributing factor to why the Falcons have missed the playoffs the last 6 years, that they haven't been able to get higher numbers. And maybe that's true. I don't tend to think that the Falcons drafting is atypical across the league compared to most NFL teams over the last 6 years. But it's closer to league average, but maybe I'm wrong in that assessment. But when I looked at those 16 players and looked at when they were drafted, I thought it was poignant to note something, because 5 of those 16 players were first round picks, 5 were fourth round picks, 3 were fifth round picks, 2 were sixth round picks, and 1 was seventh round picks. So none of the some odd, second and third round picks over the last 6 years in my assessment, have reached their eye levels or ceilings at this point in time. They've all sort of fallen somewhere around their floor or slightly above their floor. And so I think the clear-cut conclusion is that the Falcons have not done a great job developing their day 2 selections over the last 6 years. And, I wasn't doing this prior to 2018, but if you go back to 2008 to 2016, you would see a much higher hit rate, right? I would probably say, again, using hindsight and sort of going back to trying to remember what I thought of the players when we got drafted them. But I would say about half of the players managed to hit their eye levels or higher in terms of their day 2 selections. So while I don't think this is the number one reason why the Falcons have been in a 6-year playoff drought, it's probably not a coincidence that they have not done a good job drafting on day 2 over the last 6 years so far, when they did a much better job over the previous decade. So it may not be the number one reason why the Falcons have missed the playoffs, but it's probably in the top 5, right? Is their inability to really maximize those day 2 selections. Now, I tend to think that too many fans tend to try to draw that direct link between team success and draft success, of sort of as a way to just basically gripe about first round picks, of being like, we should have taken player X instead of player Y. And they sort of overrate the value of an individual pick. I certainly think you can make an argument now, and I would probably continue to make this argument, that it's less about the individual draft pick than the collective output of your draft picks. I know ESPN recently did a breakdown of, the best drafts around the NFL in the 21st century, and the Falcons, they ranked the 12 best drafts, and the Falcons ranked 4th. Their 08 draft ranked 4th on that list, right? Mostly because of Matt Ryan. But they did a pretty good job, landing some quality players on day 2 of the draft, right? They went into that draft, I think, with like 3 second-round picks. They used 2 of them to trade up to Sam Baker, who turned into a decent starter for them for a couple of years. Got Curtis Lofton in the second round, decent starter for them for a couple of years. They were able to land Harry Douglas and Thomas Deku in round 3 as well. Solid contributors. They also got Chevis Jackson, who had one good year in Atlanta. And, the other variable that increased that 08's draft standing was they found a solid day 3 gem in Corey Bierman. And then you look at another draft, back in 2016, where the Falcons did a pretty good job with Keanu Neal and Deion Jones and Austin Hooper, Devondre Campbell, and Wes Schweitzer, sort of, hitting on those, first, second, third, fourth, and even a day 3 pick in Schweitzer. And so I think it is notable to me that those drafts happen, but they're relatively rare. And so, it seems like the Falcons do it on an 8-year cycle. So 08, 16, and 2024. Okay. Like maybe this year is going to be sort of that next draft. So we'll see how that goes. But, I think that the tendency among a lot of fans is to treat first round picks as like the franchise changing draft pick, and treat every first round pick as going to be that, or should be that. And while we have players like Matt Ryan and Julio Jones that are examples of that, that's not common. And more than likely, a more realistic expectation for what your first round pick should be, and first round picks that should be considered good in hindsight, but probably some of them don't get as much love, or, first round picks like Chris Lindstrom and AJ Terrell and Jake Matthews, right? And so this info kind of reiterates what I've long thought, which is fans kind of overrate the franchise changing potential first round picks and probably underrate the value and importance of day 2 picks. So I think that's one of the lessons that we can learn from this exercise, or at least I'm trying to learn from this exercise, is probably day 2 picks probably matter a little bit more than people think. And that's why it's important that we get sort of breakout years from guys like Arnold Ebiketie and Matthew Bergeron and Troy Anderson this upcoming season, and that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be Pro Bowl caliber players, but they just need to be reliable starters that you can trust, in the same ways that Harry Douglas and Willie Moe and Robert Alford and Austin Hooper were. Right. And I think in hindsight, some of those day 2 picks that a lot of people sort of scoffed at, especially, when it came time to paying those guys on those second contracts that we're talking about, a lot of people probably underrate those guys in hindsight because they don't realize that, a 3rd round pick like Austin Hooper is actually one of the better outcomes that you're probably going to get in the 3rd round outside of you finding that perennial sort of Pro Bowl talent. Corey Peters is another great example of a 3rd round pick that is probably underrated in hindsight. He wound up starting the same number of years in the NFL that Julio Jones did with 9, right? And you can certainly play, I know everybody plays the what if scenario of like, what if we had taken TJ Watt instead of Takk McKinley? But I think probably a more interesting what if scenario is what if the Falcons had paid Corey Peters in 2014 instead of spending all that money on Tyson Jackson and Paul Soliai that offseason, right? And maybe that butterflies away, them whiffing, I guess you could say, on day 2 D tackles like Rashid Hageman and Deidre Sanat and Marlon Davidson over the next 8 years, because Corey Peters would have been a fixture on the D line. Maybe you can argue, does that mean that the Falcons are less likely to draft Grady Jarrett in 2015? I don't know the answers to that question, but it's an interesting sort of scenario to me, a lot more interesting than, TJ Watt versus Takk McKinley, which I don't know if I talked about this on the podcast, but I've gone on record that to me, I think you take TJ Watt, you probably wind up making the playoffs one of those years in like 2018 or something like that, but it just winds up delaying Dan Quinn's firing by like 1 year. But that's just my personal opinion. But I think the second lesson, more importantly, to get back on topic, is not as many players develop as I think a lot of people assume, where roughly over half of the draft picks are probably not going to reach what at least I deem as their eye levels. And we'll talk more about Brandon Dorlus later this week. But you can look at a recent episode, the most recent one where we did in late May with Braylon Dries, and my floor comp for him was Jacob Tuioti-Mariner, and my eye level comp for him was Brooks Reed. And I'm sure many of you guys scoffed at those comparisons, but at least, again, based off of this sort of reevaluation of this process over the last 6 years, there's probably like a 40% chance. There's only a 40% chance that he's better than Brooks Reed, right? At this point in time, or as good as Brooks Reed or better, right? Is basically what this information is telling me. So I think there's a lot of things to learn. There's some of the other misses I had were guys like Sterling Hofrichter and Marlon Davidson that I think injuries kind of prevented those guys from reaching their floors. Quadri Olson's the 5th miss that I accounted it. He didn't play enough in order to reach what I thought his floor comp was, which was Chris Polk. But again, check out that link in the description below and the Google Doc to sort of give your own thoughts on my previous evaluations and whether you agree or disagree with that. But, Eddie, I think commend to you for asking a great question that, will allow us to explore some of these topics. But we got more great questions from some Locked On Falcons insiders coming up, including if, Bijan Robinson is going to get some work as a return specialist, given the new kickoff rules. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So before we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I'm going to let you guys know what your first listen will be on tomorrow's episode. And we'll be back into the Falcons historian shootout with, I don't know which episode we're going to do, but this week, the 2 episodes will be me versus Charles McDonald talking about Michael Turner and Adnan Ikic versus David Shealy talking about Tony Gonzalez. And for those of you unfamiliar, it's a trivia tournament that we're doing all summer long, try to fill some of this dead time during the summer. Talking about some Falcons legends over the last 20 years, and we'll be answering trivia questions and who winds up winning it all. We'll find out probably at the end of July or early August or something like that. But certainly something to kill some of this dead time. But a question from Matt W., one of our Locked On Falcons insiders, thinking that this would be a quote unquote cool topic in the dead of summer. He says, one question I have is, what's the likelihood, considering the new kickoff rules, that we see Bijan back there returning? I think the likelihood is pretty low. I won't say that it's 0. Again, after Michael Penix and Deshaun Watson, it's hard for me to ever say anything else is 0. Like, again, I thought I was getting to a point this offseason where I was like, oh, I can say something is 0. The Falcons, 0% chance the Falcons take a quarterback in the top 10, and then that wound up being blown up in the face. But we did see Bijan return 1 punt, I think, last year against Arizona. We did see him get reps as punt and kicker returner throughout the summer and OTAs and training camp. But I think having Ray McCloud, Avery Williams around, I think the Falcons are going to be pretty comfortable with their more proven options in terms of the return game rather than asking Bijan. Now, could there be a package for Bijan? Maybe. Again, we've seen a lot of sort of speculation about how creative certain teams might get with the new kickoff rules and trying to be creative. Again, it's easy to sort of speculate at this time before we actually see it. I just know NFL teams tend to be more risk averse. So I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of some of the crazy exotic things that teams are going to do on kickoffs, but we'll see. And I'm pulling these numbers out of my butt, but let's say the increased risk of injury if you put in a sort of a key offensive or defensive player on as a return specialist, like 5%. Again, don't know what the actual number is, but let's say it's 5%. I think because NFL teams tend to be very risk averse, they'll treat it as like 50% chance. And so that's why you're probably not going to see a star player on in the return game. I know the Rams under Sean McVay typically did not have any of their star players on. They had a dedicated return specialist like the Falcons seemingly have in Ray McCloud or Avery Williams. I know Cooper Kupp did dabble for like a month as a punt returner back in 2020, but it wasn't a long-term thing. And we saw this under Arthur Smith, where it was part of, I think, the main reason why we saw D. Alford get quote-unquote benched as the nickel cornerback in the second half of the season, because that's when he took over as a full-time punt returner. And so the Falcons wanted to lighten his load by not asking him to be a full-time special teams player. You saw the similar thing happen with Cordero Patterson under Arthur Smith. So we'll see how sort of Raheem Morris fits that paradigm. Does he believe in the same things like Sean McVay and Arthur Smith did, or will he forge his own path? And speaking of return specialists, I gotta, I kind of caught it in the moment, but I now realizing, having sat on it for another like 24 hours, is like I made a mistake by not putting Avery Williams on my 53-man roster projection on yesterday's episode. So let's add him back in hindsight, in retrospect. Let's put him back on at running back as the RB4 behind Bijan, Algier, and Chase McClellan. And we'll take one defensive player off the roster. We'll take CB6 Anthony Johnson off. And maybe this year we'll actually see Avery Williams, especially if he's not the return specialist. That's Ray McCloud's job. We'll see Avery Williams, sort of get that sort of coveted personal protector role on the team that was previously held by Micah Abernathy. And Micah Abernathy can now move to the wings on the punt coverage team. So, wanted to correct that mistake. Now, our last question comes from Cody, another Locked On Falcons insider. Who would win a race between Prime Vick and Prime Lamar? I'm going to take Vick here. We've never gotten official 40 time on Lamar Jackson. He reportedly ran a 4.34 on a quote-unquote speed day in March of 2017, according to noted truth teller Bobby Petrino, the then Louisville, sorry, LSU fans, Louisville coach. I really apologize to the LSU fans. How would I ever say Bobby Petrino was their good coach? Vick officially ran a 4.33 at his combine back in 2001. And unlike the track in Indy in recent years, that was a notoriously slow track back in those days. So I would argue that Vick is probably faster than his official 40 time, and Lamar is probably not as fast as his unofficial pro day time is. So again, pulling these numbers out of my butt, but I would say like Vick is probably in reality more of a 4.29 guy, in his prime. And then Lamar probably was like a 4.38 guy or something like that in his prime. So both plenty fast, both faster than like probably 90 to 98% of NFL players. But I'm going to take Vick in terms of who was faster at their prime. And that sort of matches my eyeball test. But again, it would be a close foot race. Clearly, they're beating most guys out there in terms of a foot race. So we'll never know on that front, but we can make estimations. But thanks, Cody, Matt, and Eddie, for your brilliant questions. If you want to ask questions, all you got to do is become a Locked On Falcons insider in the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You'll get access to film breakdowns and whatnot. We'll be back tomorrow with more Falcons historian shootouts, either Michael Turner or Tony Gonzalez. We'll have a Brandon Dorless breakdown later in the week, and we'll get more floor, ceiling, and eye level comps moving forward. And maybe I'll feel so confident that my hit rate is so great that I'll completely mess up on the Brandon Dorless. Make sure you make Locked On Falcons a first listen so that you can check that out. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Guys, check out Locked On Sports Today as your second listen. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.